I'm Ken Adams, and this is the Valley View. And this week I'm joined by Gene Pfeifer, who is going to talk about the situation going on at Howard Hall and the surrounding area that has been under construction. So welcome to the show, Gene.
Thank you, Ken.
Now, I go down Mission Street a lot, and I've seen a lot of activity over the last month and a half, almost 2 months now, where a number of trees were cut down and Howard Hall was demolished. But you actually have something going on in the, well, I don't know if it's to the courts yet or not, but you're trying to get them to slow down and look at some of these issues that were brought up earlier.
Well, when you say you, it's not me so much. There are specific people that have filed appeals. I'm associated to them. We talk, we work together. I do a lot of typing for them, this type of things. It's interesting that in both cases there's some handicaps, blindness, and other things that are involved. So I'm glad to be helping them, and of course I'm very knowledgeable about construction, and my interest in true sustainability is very obvious on these two cases because the trees are there. I want to see them saved rather than starting anew, and how long will it take to have 200-year-old trees again. And Howard Hall, of course, we've lost it now, but if we've got a building that we can have for the history and, for example, to our young people, then we should keep them. So there's where it started.
And so you've been working on this for quite some period of time, actually.
Yeah, it's going on for some months. There was an associate at a meeting that was upset that nothing was being done about Howard Hall, that it was being stated that it could not be used. And I said, well, I'll go by and look at it for you. So that very day I did, and came back the next day with them with my assessment of it, that it was very usable and how much I thought it would cost to fix it. And it didn't compare at all to what they finally showed me as being what the cost presented by the hospital as being like $5.5 million to fix this little building up, compared to where we thought it was maybe between $700,000 and $800,000, someplace in that, to do a really nice building that would last for 50, 100 years.
And this has been kind of an ongoing issue for about the last 6 months to a year, is when this...
Yes.
Okay. And so, for one thing, the city had to gave them a variance without them actually asking for it, as far as Howard Hall and the surrounding trees.
Well, there's two different cases. Howard Hall went through a process where it had to be reviewed by the Historic Landmarks Commission of Salem. In the case of the trees, it went through a variance process. It was interesting that the hospital applied for building permits back in April 2014. This is prior to them making the application for the variance request. So it sounds to me like things got backwards for them. They should have been doing the variance before they applied for the building permit because it's a land use issue. So what happened is they got so far into it, they realized they had to go through these processes to get it done. Actually, in the case of Howard Hall, it did not interfere with their new construction, but became an issue that they wanted to get rid of, and the history shows that. Even their own documents and their RFP shows that they wanted to get rid of it, so it made it very hard for anyone to become interested in participating in the use of the building. So when the application then for the trees occurred, this was in May of 2014, it went through the process that went to the planning. Planning said, well, you can't build this. They had the plans complete, in other words, to apply for the permit. You can't build this facility just like you're showing it. You've got a bunch of trees that are, by my own opinion, they're significant, not my opinion, but the planner's opinion, and you have to get a variance to do so. So that then went to the variance process. I really feel it should have gone through a different method. It was defined as being a Class 3 Type 2 application. There's so many other issues there that I really feel it should have been a Type 3 application, which would have required a public hearing and the Planning Commission being involved. There's so many serious issues on the property, putting in a new road access onto the Mission Street, didn't call for a traffic study, was putting fill onto flood plain areas, building a building into flood plain areas. All these things should have been more seriously taken. Instead, it was a simple, well, if you can add all these extra parking spaces, because we think that you can, rather than there was a formula that had to apply relative to 500 feet had to be 500 feet away from the use building, and that didn't comply, and we found out in Luba. But the other part of it was as far as the trees were concerned, there had to be a reason for it, and the way their plan was drawn, it made it look like the trees had to be cut down. So I, in turn, not just wanting to criticize, I looked at it and thought, was there another solution? The property's got two levels on it. On the east side, it's lower by Winter Street, and over by Church, it's higher. So I simply saw that all we had to do is just have a part of a roadway that would still be ADA compliable. Very easy to construct. You'd put a parking lot on the low part and on the upper part. Well, that's the same as what the State of Oregon School for the Blind had done. Their buildings were upper and lower, and they let these trees that then became 200 years old or thereabouts develop themselves, and there were some magnificent trees then that after Luba had made its decision to remand it back to the city, so that he said, you're not complying to this 500-foot rule, so we're sending it back to the city for you to review it again and prove that you're compliant to that. And if you can't cut these trees down because you don't have a reason for a variance. So when we looked at that, I thought, well, how can I make this work? So I designed this parking lot where virtually the same numbers. I mean, they were real close with how I calculated. They wanted 264 parking spaces, 88 of which exceeded the code. You have a code which says you've got so many square feet of building use, and that then allows for so many parking spaces. Well, it exceeded it by 88. So I showed that they could have the parking with virtually the same number of spaces. I counted 250 at least on my alternative plan. And that the building could be built the way they wanted to build it. Nothing was wrong with it, but we could not get the city, or particularly the hospital, would not sit down with any of us to do a discussion on, let's make this work. Let's do something that's good for the community, and in fact for you. It's proven that these urban trees are good for the environment. It's good for the owner. Arborists say that it increases the value of property. All these things were just completely ignored, and they would not come to the table. There was no dialogue at all.
One of the things too that you're kind of alluding to is the fact that mature trees give off shade and then reduce your air conditioning cost and have other benefits as well. They generally take out a pretty fair amount of carbon, which is a situation that we're looking at trying to do something about currently. Well,
the trees, I don't want to just repeat what you said, but yes, they give off oxygen. And of course, that's good for, we got trees all over the place and other plants, and even algae are putting off oxygen for us. But the significance in the urban setting is they literally cool the area. So if you didn't have the trees, the temperature would be several degrees Fahrenheit warmer if you didn't have the trees. And of course, most of these trees are deciduous trees that were cut. And those trees in the wintertime, they let the sun in, so it's good for the setting. It warms things up. In the winter or in the summertime, we have the shade.
Yeah, and those are very beneficial things. And the City of Salem has actually put a price on that as well, saying that it's worth, it was just under $300 per tree.
Well, there was one tree that they put a sign on. It's over by the downtown fire station, urban setting. Happens to be a 38-inch red oak tree. The red oak tree doesn't even make it on their list of recognized trees in Salem. But they showed that tree was worth us $277 a year because of the benefits that it would give to society or the owner of the property, all of these things. So that tree attributed to that. Well, there was a 42-inch red oak that was clear cut on January the 5th, along with 15 others and more that were supposedly not significant. And I think that, I mean, this is strange that we could call a 24-inch white oak tree that it's significant and nothing else is significant in our city. What if somebody wanted to go and cut down an 8-foot diameter redwood tree and it wasn't on this list? And then they're going to say it was not significant.
Well, there was, what, like a 60-inch fir tree that
there were several of them that were at 60 inches, and they were over 100 or over 200 years old. And those trees were cut without any hesitation. The decision by LUBA, which was not complete. It had remanded it back, and part of what Tim Cowan, one of the petitioners, said is that we need to know about what other trees are significant besides 24-inch white oaks. And so that was part of the concern in the appeal, that definition needs to be applied. Well, before a chance to have done that, and while the issue was still pending for the land use issue, again, the decision was made by LUBA on December the 31st, and on the which was a Wednesday, and on the following week, I think it was the 5th, on Monday, they clear cut. They left the 24-inch white oak set, but they cut all these other trees down, and they put up this screen on the fence beforehand so people couldn't see it. The whole thing's a real shame. It's a shame for the hospital. They spend, I read the numbers, I have the tax return for them for 2013 or something. They spend like $800,000 a year for marketing and public relations. How much value would they have had by leaving these trees be, as long as they could still use the property as they wanted to?
Well, it is an interesting question. The other thing, too, I guess that kind of has upset me, and I did, when I was late in high school and early college, one of the things I was very interested in was like soil conservation and trees in forestry. And one of the things that I've noticed going on out there during their construction is they're awfully close. They have these little orange fences, plastic fences around the trees, but they don't seem to be anywhere near as big as what the root system is. And they've got heavy equipment out there going by these trees very close. They've been digging in, so I'm sure they're digging up some of the roots and like that to support these trees. And in some places they have mounds of rock and fill stacked up. And I think this is going to be a problem for some of those trees to survive. But that's my opinion.
No, it's very much correct. We have arborists that have been looking at it. I've been watching it. I've had to be very sensitive about tree construction around trees. I've been in construction industry myself for literally over 50 years. And you have to be careful about how you do it. The normal is that this protective fence would be at least at the drip line of the trees. Now, in some cases, they've got it close to that, but they're not looking at which side. There's a tree that's leaning over Mission Street, beautiful tree with mistletoe growing in it, and they've got it so that the side where the roots would be, mostly trying to keep it from rotating onto Mission Street, they've got that, I think, too close. But I noticed, too, that they had cut equipment tracks through before they bothered to put this up, and that they have now excavated, in some cases, 4, maybe 5 feet even, where these trees are now sitting on pedestals of dirt. And the dirt is highly alluvial. In other words, it's got rocks in it, so it drains well. So if we let this condition go through the summer, there could be that these trees will die. Then they're going to say, oh, well, we didn't mean to, or something else. Well, this is the code requires that trees be protected so we don't have something happen to them. There's an interesting thing that's going on in this case, too. They went ahead with the construction of this facility, acquired building permits prior to the land use issues being resolved. The code.
There were still land issues.
The land issue. Well, then we still have the remand from the from LUBA to the city, so that's the issue still open. I would maintain or argue even for them that they could go ahead and start building their building, but stay away from these trees. You're going to have to come up with an alternate site plan, but they didn't. They're constructing it the way it was drawn, except leaving the trees set there. Well,
some of the trees.
Well, the white, well, particularly the white oak trees. So the city went ahead and gave them a permit contrary to the ORS. Oregon Building Codes Division in ORS, I think it's 445, says that they have superior position because the authority of the city came from the state, and that's then regulated by the Oregon Codes Division. Well, if you go to Oregon Administrative Rules, there's a section there specifically that says you cannot issue a building permit until all the land use issues are resolved. So we've got something going on here. And they won't even let us go on the property to take a look at it to see if these conditions are satisfactory, which we don't think so from what we can observe on the outside. So all of this, people are saying that that they feel that this has been set up so they can get so far that the trees finally have a problem and say, oh, well, I guess the issue's moot. We'll just keep going with what our plan was.
Well, I mean, that's what it felt like to me when I saw them clear cutting on January 5th. It seems like they were trying to create facts on the ground so that then they could claim, well, you know, this has already been done, and they might have to pay a fine or something, but then they got what they wanted.
Well, interesting, anticipating this happening, there was a acknowledgement issued from Norm Gruber at the hospital to the city. There's no signature agreeing to it from the city. This was on December 17th, I think it's called acknowledgement, where he says that, well, you give us the permit and we'll go ahead and we'll do all this work, but if we find out later that there's a problem with the land use issue, we'll back it off and correct it all. Well, they're talking about millions of dollars of cost, and somebody at a given point is going to say, oh, let's let them keep doing what they're doing. Well, no, that's not what should happen. We have cases in the code where people build a building without a permit, etc., and they are actually caused to demolish the thing
Right.
and move it or whatever the case may be. So this is a political game that's going on that needs to be, let's say, we need to perceive into it and what is going on with it.
Even though, like, say, Howard Hall has been demolished, it still is a question of law. Do we actually have law that's enforceable, and are people held responsible?
Right. Well, in the case of Howard Hall, everybody thought it was over with. It was in the paper. But the case is, it's still ongoing. The Beverly Rushing, the blind lady, she's still in Oregon Court of Appeals with it. They have filed a request for reconsideration because their thing was, it was not to the court. They filed it properly with the court, the notice of appeal, but they served the hospital the next morning. Instead of mailing it on the day that it was filed at the Court of Appeals, they served it the next morning. It actually got to the hospital quicker than if he'd put it in the mail. So that issue is now under discussion, but they're still there, and the court is still receiving this information to make a decision if it's okay. So about the Howard Hall may be torn down, but its issue is still standing out there. We should not let things like this become precedent that didn't matter. I gave an analogy in something that says, I gave it to Tim, I think it was, that it shouldn't be that the party's cow is allowed to die, and then so that the issue is the cow died, so it's moot. Well, no, the family is then deprived of milk from that cow for how many years? Well, the same thing, if we have Howard Hall and it's gone, how long have the citizens of Salem been deprived of that historical attribute?
You know, the other thing that you kind of came across, and we haven't mentioned it yet, but there's a conflict of interest part of this as well between the city and the hospital.
Well, this is something that we've just recently discovered. Another civic group in town sent the email information to us. It was called, I call it the tip of the iceberg, and so we looked into it further. And we found that there was a 2013 agreement between the hospital and the city for a $70 million bond issue. And the bond issue, we could say it's legitimate. We see this kind of thing in other states, etc. The only problem with this particular one, it looks like it could be that the bond was issued prior to the permit, or certainly prior to the construction. And so that they're caught in a bind. There's a certain legal aspect to this, that if you're promising somebody you're going to pay us $70 million for this bond or give us this money, but we're going to provide this attribute in this manner for your security, there's also a time frame in which this is normally done. In other words, you don't get a $70 million bond done and then complete the work 5 years later. It normally is assumed it's going to be done contemporaneous with the bond. So if they weren't able to get the approval with how it was presented, again, I represented that the permit was applied for, actually I think it was applied for April 30th of 2014. Well, the application for the site review occurred in May, so it's after the fact. It really should have gone the other way around. Application for a site review preliminary to applying for a building permit. So they've now got caught. I think that they intended to do the construction last summer. So now they're pushing real hard on it, and to me these are indications of why have they been so resistive to common sense of sitting down with the citizens and having some dialogue as to, can't you try this alternate method to get it done?
And the plan that you came up with, you know, like with the parking lot and like that, would not have cost them extra money?
No, actually, I felt it would maybe save them $1 million because the amount of equipment time they had in there was excessive. And actually, my opinion occurred before I observed the construction. To have cut the grade on the western part of the property down 2, 3, 4, 5 feet, and then moved it over to the eastern side, they wouldn't have had to done anything. They would have just had to done, as I described, create this little roadway just next to their maintenance building. They just would have had a roadway to conform to ADA, and it would have been maybe 80 or 100 feet long, just to take care of that, and then the rest of it would be on the grades it was on.
And ADA is
Americans for Disability Act.
Right.
That's to make
sure that people who are disabled can park and move around.
Yeah, so it's not too steep. Yeah, and actually it would have been beneficial because the parking lots then, instead of the way they did it, if we can do it this way, so we had this lower, and then there's this bank here, so they had to cut this bank down, dig this down, and move this material over to this side, so that the slope of the parking actually becomes greater in the parking areas than what they could have had a nice gentle slope at 1/4 inch per foot up on either one of the parking lots, so that people wouldn't have so much trouble getting out of the doors and all this stuff. And it's not extreme, but the only spot where there would be a slight slope would have been this, but they made it so the whole thing had to slope. So to me, it's contradictory to good planning.
So this is going to be before the courts. You've filed your brief.
Tim Cowan filed a brief on it's called an opening brief. He filed it on Tuesday, the 24th, and now the respondent, which is Salem Hospital, has 21 days to give a reply brief. And then a little short time after that, there will be what's called the oral argument. So in that case, though, if anybody listening to this, Mr. Cowan, and in the case of Beverly Rushing, if they're to proceed forward, they would need some donations from some people to support, because at a given point they can't continue to be what we call pro se. Pro se means that they're doing their own representation. In front of the oral part at Oregon Court of Appeals, it has to be done with an attorney. So they will need some donations at that point to support someone standing there and speaking for them in front of the panel, in front of the
So they'll need an
court.
attorney.
They'll need an attorney.
And I know that we've used a lot of jargon, you know, as part of explaining this, but it's necessary because we have lots of laws, ordinances, and so on, and you have to refer to those when you're making these kinds of decisions. And that's the process. How you go through the process is important to make sure that everybody's needs are being addressed. And that seems to have been really shortcutted during this whole process, because there has not really been a whole lot of public discussion about this at all. And I noticed that when I was at city council meetings, quite often the conversation was cut off, that the mayor and members of the city council didn't seem to want to hear too much about Howard Hall.
Well, the issue, let's go to that. The Howard Hall to be demolished was turned down by the Historical Review Commission of Salem. There's a group of citizens that dedicate their time to determine if they should be preserved and stay that way. So this was presented to them, and as I recall, there was 3 out of 4 of the conditions that the hospital failed to provide for that building to be torn down. They felt it could be remediate it reasonably economically. They felt that it had a user. In fact, I was the one that presented that there were users. They said that during the process where they put out an RFP that they didn't get any response. Well, I agree with that. It was such a negative thing, nobody would have wanted to or waste their time. You know, basically they're appealing to developers that want to do millions of dollars worth of projects, not something that's just a pain in the butt to do. They wanted to do something significant. So, so when we determined it could be done, the Historic Review Commission showed, hey, this is the case, and they went through why it was the case. And then the hospital then had, I'm not sure what the amount of days was, but they had so many days to appeal that to the city council. Well, the city council didn't even wait for that to happen, and I was at the meeting where they said, let's call it up. So call it up, we'll have our own public hearing on this, and to me it indicated immediately that there was a bias. There should not be any bias in these kind of things. So they had then their own public hearing to review it, and they ignored all the decisions made by their own commission and went forward with it the way it was and said, well, we feel this should be done. We feel that the therapy playground is more important than this building, and that's what happened. And I don't feel that should have happened that way. And then I guess to point out the brevity part, it would go before them. I know even for when they said let's do a call up to have a public hearing, even that one had no discussion. So that to me indicates that this was discussed
prior to
before the meeting, which is contrary to
the open meetings
law. The Attorney General of Oregon is aware of this too, in particular. And we've been given what the rules are, is that you can't have a series of decisions, whether it's by email or a series of phone calls, somebody making a call and finding out or making sure what was everybody going to vote. It can't happen that way. It has to be decisions and discussions are made in front of the public. So that happened in 30 seconds, is what I recall. And then when the meeting occurred to talk about it, of course, they all talked about it as individuals for different reasons, but there was just a lot of sensitivity. Well, I think that would be good for people. One counselor said, well, my child has disabilities, and this would be good for my child. So there was a lot of emotion involved, but it wasn't the facts that are in the statutes. The city has its own statutes, and you should go by those. You can't make them up as you go. So that decision happened. Again, it was obvious that something had been discussed ahead of time.
I think, and this is my personal opinion, I think it was speeded up because Tom Anderson was elected to the 2nd Ward seat, and I think they wanted to get this done before he was seated. But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that Tom Anderson had been sympathetic for Howard Hall, yes.
Yes. Well, Gene, I want to thank you for coming in and discussing this, and I'm sure we'll have to have you back at some point to give us an update on what's going on.
Very good. Appreciate being here.
Well, I think it's important information for the citizens of Salem to see how things are actually working here in Salem. So I want to thank you for watching Valley View, and join us again.